Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about the rise of North American settlement, specifically English settlement in the New World. And first, I want to talk about Native Americans, kind of their continued existence, their life before and during colonization of the New World, and how they interacted with incoming European settlements. And so, what we'll talk about again are English settlements of the New World and Native American life. This really highlights larger trends in which we're talking about the general settlement of North America and the eventual rise of the 13 colonies, which will become the United States. What you see here is a general map of the path that the first Americans, right, what becomes Native Americans or the indigenous inhabitants of North America takes as they're settling the New World. Again, this is contested, debated, and always open to change. And what you see here is the general trend that they cross the Bering Strait from Siberia and gradually work their way down North America, branching out into different areas of North America all the way down the South American coast. This theory has been updated and continually revised as new settlements are found in South America and the southeastern United States that are earlier and earlier, causing historians and archaeologists to question just how North America was settled, when it was settled, and if alternative pathways were developed. For instance, were the earlier inhabitants coming by boat over the Pacific Ocean, or how did they actually reach South America long before earlier historians had initially thought? Okay, but this is generally the most accepted version of what's happened, right? This gradual pathway down, and North American Indians are following the big game across the Bering Strait, settling into North and South America, and then generally get isolated as rising sea levels flood what becomes the Bering Strait, separating what becomes Russia from what becomes Alaska, and dividing Eurasia from North and South America. So again, this is just the general, most accepted theory. There are other debates and theories out there, and you can see again the alternative pathways or the different pathways that developed as well. This is just a general map of the major tribes of what becomes the United States, right, and the different groupings that historians, archaeologists, and linguistics experts have grouped Native Americans in. And so the point here is that the inhabitants of North America are quite diverse, quite complex, living in very different societies. And certainly, if you're a Native American from the American Northeast, your culture, ideas, and beliefs are very different from the American Southeast or the American West, right? It's a very diverse, complex social and economic system that develops. And certainly, this is one that's always changing, always fluid, and more complex than early settlers would have us believe. But just so you can see where different groups might lie, we're going to talk about the Pequots today, Mohegans over here. You probably may have heard of the Sioux over here, the Nez Perce over here that were involved in major wars with the United States, or the Comanche down here, and the larger settlers of the American Southwest over here. Again, you can see it's kind of hard to read. This is how they're grouped, and you can see exactly where they're living. It's not to say it's a perfectly accurate map, but just to give you a general linguistic and cultural overview of where people live. Okay. The rise of agriculture is important for settlement and for the rise of civilizations. Corn cultivation spreads out from the Incas and the Aztec groups in Mexico. Right? The Aztecs are living in central Mexico. They're highly involved in corn cultivation. It's moving out to the American pueblos of the Southwest, the mound builders of the Ohio River Valley, the southwestern deserts, and corn leads to a transformation of Native American life as it helps these nomadic hunting groups live in more stationary agricultural settlements. Right, they're moving around less, they're more settled. This allows for more time to be devoted to larger, higher thinking platforms, although again, not always. And what we see are quite complex agricultural systems developing as the people of the Atlantic seaboard, especially the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee, developing this kind of three-sister farming, three-tier farming of corn, beans, and squash, giving quite a varied, nutritious, and rich diet to Native Americans of the area. All right, in the Northeast, famously, the Iroquois Confederacy brings together 5 different nations in what's now kind of upstate New York. And so what we see, again, are the transformation and cultural development of different indigenous groups to North America. And so overall, by 1492, right on the verge of Columbus's uh, explorations to the New World, we have Native Americans largely, although not always, living in small, scattered settlements because a lot of Native Americans are still quasi-nomadic. They don't have the population density or the resources to support a population density that's very high, right? Simply, you're going to have a much smaller population density than in other areas of the world, especially China and India. That's not to say that cities don't exist, right? We see cities in the American Southwest. We see certainly large cities in Mexico. Right? What becomes Mexico City under the Aztecs is this massive, thriving, economically complex city that gets decimated and destroyed by the Spanish. We have villages that are loosely connected and tied together in what we consider tribes today. Again, it's kind of a more loose confederation or loose connections than we like to think about, but the villages generally have some larger affiliation, although the size, nature, and scale of this affiliation varies quite widely. Cultures are often matrilineal, which means that the descendant being traced through the mother's line. European societies are patriarchal or patrilineal, which means that descent is traced through the father's line. This is just a major change or major kind of cultural difference that incoming Europeans have to confront. And the other major difference is, unlike Europeans, where land is scarce, right? There's a high population, low levels of land. Native Americans aren't thinking in lands in terms of actual possession, right? They're not having to continually own it, fight over it, claim it, but rather by its usefulness. And this is a very different conception of land than we have today and that Europeans had in the past. So overall, they're too few and too widely scattered to tax the environment in the same way that Europeans were already taxing the environment in Europe. Last lecture, I talked about the rise of Europeans and the overpopulation that European countries are already dealing with. We don't have the same huge population numbers in the New World, right? The population is big, but again, the population is roughly the same for all of the Americas as it is for Western Europe. So the population density, therefore, is a lot less. And so what we have is a less onerous presence in the New World, especially on the environment. Simply a lot of nomadic groups that can't overtax the environment. Right, they live in this largely loosely defined area that they might move around in quite a bit. And so if they overtax the environment, well, there's simply nothing for them to do or nowhere for them to go. And so you have to have this relatively low population growth if the Native Americans are to succeed, right? If the tribe, if the village is to do well. And overall, there's probably between 2 and 10 million people living in the United States, or what becomes the United States. And this is a hugely debated and quite wide number. I mean, there's a population difference of 8 million people. And this 8 million is just a fraction of probably the 50 million that live throughout North and South America. And so we can see is that there's huge numbers of indigenous people not living in what becomes the United States. And again, the 10 million people we can kind of conceptualize as 30th or so of the population today. Right now, there's 300, 320, 330 million people, and so 10 million is just the population of New York City alone, spread out through the same geographic area. So the population density is remarkably low. What you see then with this incoming European presence, in the way that I alluded to before, is the rise of disease. Right, smallpox, typhus, measles, mumps, diphtheria, all move in with devastating effects. We talked about the movement of Spanish conquistadors around North America. Right? What are these guys bringing with them as they're searching for gold? They're bringing with them disease. Unknowingly, sometimes knowingly, but most of the time unknowingly, spreading disease wherever they go. Here you can just see, right, smallpox wreaking havoc on a North American indigenous person. And what this means is that the past and the future are targeted. How so? Because these diseases generally affect the elderly and the children, the young, the most, right? They're the most susceptible for disease. It's the 20-somethings, the teenagers, the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings that have the more robust immune system. And so culturally and significantly, the previous generations being decimated, right? The elderly are dying out, taking with them ideas of tradition, their own past, their own history, and kind of they're the keepers of that particular culture. They're dying out. At the same time, children are dying out in huge numbers. The future, right? The future is just being taken away from a lot of these North American tribes. As children die, the future dies with them. Okay, and so what we see, again, following the spread of disease always comes first, is this cultural confrontation that develops first in Spanish settlements and then gradually in English and French settlements to some degree. And we have this different notions of culture that both struggle to deal with, right? It's one world confronting an almost completely different world. How can you make sense of what's going on? Right? How can Native Americans who don't have the same sense of property make sense of European claims of land possession? What the English do is they map, they terrace, they put up fences, they have individual ownership of land, right, coming with them from England. This is a massively different notion of land control than Native Americans have. Europeans also, in part due to the religious nature of their society, have this sense of superiority, right? They view themselves as superior, as somehow better, somehow more civilized than the Native American cultures that they confront. Right? And certainly there's a sense of reciprocity in Native American culture, of gift giving, of sharing to some degree, that doesn't exist in European ideas, right? The sense that leaders are essentially the gift givers, right? The people that are leading the reciprocity efforts as a way of maintaining their own power. This idea does not simply translate very well to European senses of greed or entitlement. So both groups are trying to understand and bring the other group into their own conceptual universe, to incorporate the other group. Right, as the English move into Virginia in a manner that we'll get to later, the Powhatan tribe are trying to incorporate the English. They say, oh, this is another group that might become useful to us, a group of many that we control and are part of our tribe. Let's incorporate them. Right? How can we understand their sense of the worldview? All right, but Europeans are generally unwilling to conform to indigenous expectations of generosity, of gift giving. Right, the sense of the European greed is quite different than Native American reciprocity, and I would say in no other manner than war is this cultural confrontation more evident. Europeans fight wars. Why? To destroy their enemies, to gain territory. Again, land is a premium. You fight to gain land. Your enemy must be destroyed at all costs. And this goes back to Europeans dealing with non-European groups. It's going back to Christians interacting with and dealing with non-Christian groups. It deals with a sense of you have to destroy your enemy as much as possible. Native Americans fight war to gain people. Right, again, the population density is quite low. The numbers are quite low. You might wage war to take captives, to kidnap people, especially women and children. You're not fighting wars over land. There's always land, or almost always land. Why would you fight a war over something that you have a lot of, or you don't have a lot of, is people. And of course, this drives Europeans crazy when Native Americans don't kill them, but rather kidnap their wives, women, and children. Also, Native Americans fight for revenge, right? To revenge the death, the killing, perceived injustices that were brought upon them. Right? New to the Native American mindset is this idea of mass slaughter, right? You're going to kill people? What? We want to preserve as much life as possible. You want to take our land and take our land permanently? No, we don't fight for that, right? We're not talking about land ownership and land possession. Europeans, again, can't understand this sense of captivity, of revenge killing. All right. Native Americans can't understand civilians becoming more heavily involved in warfare. And Europeans can understand why women and children are a legitimate target of Native Americans. And certainly Europeans are moving in, destroying the villages on the land that they want. The sense of total war that you just kind of move in, take, and destroy is a major new European concept. Finally, with religion and gender. Europeans come in with this very strong missionary zeal, right? They're expanding for notions of God, glory, and gold. God is certainly a major component of it, right? The Spanish and later European Protestants, along with the Portuguese and basically any other group you want, are arriving in droves, and they want to Christianize the natives. They want to Christianize the natives to their particular brand of Christianity. Again, this is key because there's different brands of Christianity, right? There's the Spanish or Catholic, the English or Protestant. This becomes a major idea and problem later on. In the Native American senses of religious systems are so different that they have a very hard time trying to understand what Europeans are talking about, right? How can you understand or easily translate notions of heaven and hell, of purgatory, of Catholic saints, of what's expected to you to follow the religion, right? Of baptism. Another major sense of concern or debate is the Trinity. Right? It's very confusing, especially to people unfamiliar with any notion of Christianity, that there's essentially one God and three gods, three parts of co-equal parts of the same God. Right? How does this work? How do you explain this? How do you translate this in a manner that makes sense? Europeans have a hard time making sense of this for a long time. How are they expected to translate it? And the other part is that Jesus, according to Christian belief, died and rose from the dead. It's another very strong, difficult issue that is central to European religion that makes very little sense to Native Americans. And the last part is the idea of the Eucharist, right? That on Sunday, when you take the bread and drink the wine, that this has been transformed into the bread and body of Christ. To Native Americans, that sounds like cannibalism. Europeans are often attacking Native American communities, accusing them of cannibalism. Well, to the Native Americans, this sounds like cannibalism to them. And so what we saw are Europeans especially, but not limited to, Spanish conquistadors seeing Native Americans as inferior because of their different religious beliefs. Right? Now religion is going to be justified or used for justification in taking over Native American land. The last issue is gender. We talked a little bit about this. Native American societies are more matrilineal. Property and power moves through the female line. Right? This view causes Europeans to view Indian men, Native American men, as weak, easily overrun, as lazy. What do Native American men do? They hunt. What do European men do? They work. Right? Hunting in Europe's a pastime. It's it's a privilege. It's something you do for fun. All right. They see Native Americans as participating in these fun activities, not actually working. Well, for Native Americans, hunting is a major component of their lives. And so you have this kind of very different view on hunting and very different views on how gender is perceived and how people are perceived, right? Here you can see a very masculinized view of of indigenous women, right? They're muscular, they're strong, they're doing a lot of work, right? They're very different than what European women wear, do, and are conceptualized as. You're not going to see any paintings of European women with the same muscles as you see here with Native Americans, right? And these kind of strange, different religious ceremonies that Native Americans are involved in makes very, very little sense to Europeans. Like another sense of kind of strong, dominant Indian Native American wife. Okay. So transitioning now to the second major point I want to talk about today is the rise of the English. And what we see, in England are settler colonies, right? The English are there to settle. The French and Portuguese, to some degree, are there to trade. It's a very different idea. Right? You need land, you're a permanent resident, and the land's going to become yours. You're not just there to make money, to trade, and to then get out, right? And so you have a very different view of land. So being a settler colony is very different than being simply a trading colony, right? Access to land is key in the English mindset. We kind of alluded to this before. And land equals liberty. If you own your own land, you're kind of more independent. You're not beholden to anybody else. And so land is key. The English are always in need of labor. The population is never what they want. They're always looking for sources of labor. The King of England is using the land of the New World, starting with James the First of England, as a way of rewarding his supporters. Right? He owes people money in England. He wants to reward people in England. Here, take all this land in the New World. And so for colonies like Pennsylvania, there's a close connection between settlement and the king. And by and large, through much of this period, it's a period of benign neglect. England's more concerned with their own issues. They have their own problems. They have their own concerns. Let the North American colonies do as they please for a long period of time. We're just going to neglect them for a while. And by and large, they're neglecting them because the North American colonies are confined to narrow coasts of land near the coast, with Native American threats very real, very close. And although over time the threat gets largely removed, constantly a major issue. Okay, so through this interaction, we see, through the incoming English, we see major changes to European life, right? The English can move in, Native Americans are still there, they're interacting, they're changing. The French, again, are moving in places like Canada. We see the fur trade develop, all right? This is a huge European prerogative. The Dutch, the English, the French are all involved in the fur trade. And so what this means is that Europeans are going to want to trade whatever they want, whatever they have, especially guns, to the indigenous inhabitants of North America for fur. Right? Fur is this hot commodity in Europe. They're going to make hats. They're going to use it for dress. There's a huge demand for fur, and so they need Native Americans to get them the furs for them. All right, they're going to give Native American society cool new things, right? Cool new European goods that become aspects of indigenous life. Beads, certainly for trade, for power, for prestige, for decoration. Metal cutting edges. Can you imagine the labor saving that a metal cutting edge hoe or axe can provide, right? It's a huge advantage. It's a hot commodity. These are things that are in demand in Native society. Certainly guns, right, that you need for the fur trade, and alcohol, unfortunately. And so alcohol becomes first used for religious ceremonies as a way of becoming closer to the afterlife or God, or now kind of have this higher spiritual platform becomes incorporated into Native American life, and then unfortunately remains a major issue. And so what you have are wars taking place as Native Americans want this stuff. They want access to these trade goods, and they're going to go to war to fight for increased access to fur. Again, at least the depopulation of certain indigenous furs in North America, but it also leads to a rise of violence in Native American life as stronger groups want to expand their territory and take control of the fur trade over weaker groups. Right? And who wins? Who has the advantage? The youth, right? Native American young. Certainly, Native American elders had a lot of power in indigenous societies. Now the power is shifting to the youth. Why? Because these guys are more involved in the slave trade. In the fur trade. They're the ones that are going out and making money. They're getting the beads, the metal cutting edges, the alcohol, the guns that are in hot demand in Native American societies. And those that are located near European trading settlements have a huge advantage. Right? If you happen to be near Albany, near Hartford, near Montreal, or Quebec, this gives you a huge advantage because you have the access to Europeans. Right? You can control access to Europeans and European trading goods. And so what we see are major changes to Native American life quite quickly through trade, and Europeans certainly are starting to view the indigenous people that they encounter as just simply all Indians. Again, here you can see different hats that are modifications of the beaver hat. Certainly Continental is probably the one that you're most familiar with, maybe the Navy hat as well, or the clerical hat, I'm not sure, but you can just see again how in demand the beaver is in Europe as a way of becoming a major element of European fashion. Okay. European interaction then leads to Native kind of regrouping, right? Adopting to this new way of life that Europeans are forcing upon them. They regroup, they reconceptualize, they move, right? They're going to develop new, what they call praying towns, right? So new settlements are sometimes focused on either indigenous or incoming European religion. Sometimes even focused around mission stations or mission schools. All right, so there's kind of this close interaction between missionaries and these new praying towns. New larger tribes, right? As we have decimation of a population, Native Americans are going to kind of regroup, reconceptualize, move into bigger tribes, kind of for protection, for safety, to rebuild their numbers. They're going to see larger tribes. So when the Iroquois Confederation gets a lot stronger, the Cherokee get a lot stronger as a result of this realignment, right? The tribal basis, the chief of the tribe also has much more power than he had in the past. And this interaction between Europeans and Native Americans oftentimes leads to war, right? Sometimes big wars, sometimes devastating wars, wars against initial settlers, right? Wars for people, and just general wars against Europeans who keep taking their land. Once the land moves inward and land becomes inward, or once your Native Americans realize the Europeans aren't going anywhere, there's going to be wars against these settlers, especially the Powhatan attack Jamestown. You have a devastating war in Connecticut known as King Philip's War. By and large, they're failures for indigenous communities and their larger failure to unite. In hindsight, it's a major problem, but this is a big problem. What we have is a continual conflict, and this conflict is going to be a major cornerstone of American history for the next 200 years. As European settlers move inland, the reaction is oftentimes war, maybe first accommodation to some degree, or attempted incorporation, and then war, once you realize that what European interaction actually means. And certainly no more beaver, right? The beaver almost go extinct in North America as a result of this overhunting, and European animals are starting to take over, right? The horse, the pig, all these European animals have major changes to indigenous life, right? all of a sudden, war and work get transformed thanks to horses. Changes in diet with the pig. And again, the pig are just kind of nasty animals for a while. They just simply dig up and eat all this North American food stock. But they're incorporated into Native American life. Here you can see, right, it's kind of a brutal period on both sides. Here you can have the Virginia Massacre of 1622, right, fighting. But after some degree, we see some degree of stabilization. It's not you can't have a period of war going on forever. And what we see is the fusion to some degree of these different cultures, where incoming Europeans adopt to Native American life to some degree, and Native Americans become more quote unquote white, right? With regard to war, religion, marriage, and trade, we see a lot of interaction, a lot of back and forth, a lot of incorporation of both values. What does this mean? Europeans start taking on indigenous aspects of war for captives. Native Americans start taking on European levels of war, right? This is clearly a sense of a total war, right, by the indigenous Powhatan people of Virginia. You see intermarriage, you see fusion of religion. Native American beliefs become incorporated, kind of tied in with Christian beliefs, and trade, kind of going back and forth. To some degree, there's a balance, but this balance can always favors Europeans, and over time, right, certainly Native Americans are being pushed off the land. Again, here you can see Europeans taking on trappings of indigenous culture, right, with the hats, with the moccasins, with the clothes, right, with aspects of war, with what they're wearing. And the Europeans are just realizing that Native American clothes, culture, ways of war made sense in the New World, and so they're going to adopt to it. Right? They're not giving up all of their European values, but to some degree they're becoming distinct. Right? They're becoming a uniquely American people. Again, here you can see examples of Europeans being taken captive, right, during war. And so what we have, again, over time emerging are English colonies. These English colonies, again, are generally confined to the English seaboard. Of course, there's the Hudson Bay Company up north, and they kind of stretch from what's now Maine to eventually what's now Florida, but by and large, the first waves of settlement are in kind of the mid-Atlantic and certainly the New England regions. Okay, the first one is the American kind of mid-Atlantic South, right? What we have are these two colonies, especially Virginia and Maryland, emerging quite early. Right, Virginia is going to be settled very early in Jamestown, 1609. What we have is this settlement that is just intent on finding natural resources. They can't find any natural resources. They're living in malaria-ridden swamps. They're dying. They're refusing to work. They're being threatened by indigenous inhabitants. Right, they're just not doing well. But they keep their act together. They keep holding on, and they survive that first winter. They get reinforcements. They get new people coming in. Got to replace the people that died off and maybe were eaten. We're not entirely sure. But very quickly, the settlers of Jamestown realize that tobacco is going to be their lifeblood. They're there to make money, and tobacco is going to provide them this money. Why not, right? They can make a fortune selling tobacco. And certainly there's all these debates over what tobacco is, what its health benefits are. Does it help you with your breathing? Does it help you with your lung capacity? Again, all this turns out to be false, but people don't know this at the time. But, again, tobacco is a fairly addictive, although not nearly as addictive substance as it will become. And so there's eventually a huge demand for tobacco in Europe. And Virginia has very good soil for growing tobacco. The issue was that tobacco wears out the soil, depletes the nutrients of the soil quite quickly. It's also a very labor-intensive crop. It requires constant maintenance, picking, weeding, tying, drying. Right? There's a lot of labor involved in tobacco. And so what you have is this constant labor shortage where the people growing tobacco need more workers. What do they turn to? They turn to indentured servitude. And so very quickly, the American experience is going to be based on some degree of indenturement or even slavery, right? Now, of unfree people. And at some point, there's like, I think it's like 70 or 80% of the American population uh, was or had been indentured themselves, right? They're highly desired, and over time they have decreasing opportunities, right? So what are indentured servants? Initially, they have a lot of advantages. Initially, they're inexpensive, right? The ship will pay for you to come to Virginia. The planter will then pay the ship owner for your voyage. Again, there's a lot of exploitation involved. Something like if you die halfway through the voyage, your family then owes the ship money, even though you're dead, because you made it halfway. But by and large, these laborers, they don't cost a lot initially. You just have to reimburse the ship owner for the cost of the voyage. Generally, most of the indentured workers want to be here, right? They're to some degree volunteering to come. I guess this just shows how bad life is, how limited economic opportunities there are in England. Up until the era of the Great Fire in the 1660s, but by and large, they want to be here, right? They're volunteering. They're actually have some desire to come, and they understand kind of the terms of their commitment. They speak the language, right? There's no kind of cultural linguistic divide, and they're Christian, which again is another huge cultural advantage. However, there are lots of disadvantages to indentured servitude, as the settlers of Virginia, the tobacco farmers and settlers of Virginia quickly find out. A lot will leave simply after a few years. Right, you lose your labor force, get them for like 7 years, and that's it. And then they're gone. And they're costly to maintain while under contract, right? You have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to generally treat them well. And these guys are suing all the time if they're not being treated well, right? If you're very aware, the indentured servants are very aware of the terms of the contract, and if you violate that contract, they'll take you to court quite readily. And while they have limited rights, they do have some rights, including the rights to sue. Again, another important American institution. And so they'll take you to court. They'll take advantage of the limited rights they have and sue you, which is a major disadvantage if you're trying to have a cheap labor force, right? You have to keep them happy. You have to ensure their limited rights are being honored and maintained. These guys speak the language, which is another problem. It's both advantage and disadvantage, right? They understand what's going on. You can't really take advantage of them linguistically as you can with other groups, right? They know how to operate within the system. A lot were again European Christian, and so they can't be enslaved. They're not used to heavy farming. If you're coming from England, right, they're not used to heavy farming. You're a farmer, but not used to these heavy farming loads. And you're not used to the heavy labor that the labor-intensive tobacco involves, and they need land afterwards. They have to be provided with something, right? That's the deal. You get them for 7 years, but you have to provide them with land afterwards. This becomes a huge issue as these guys get increasingly marginal land. You can read an indentured servant letter here. There's nothing to comfort me. Nothing we got in here but sickness and death, right? It's nothing. It's not the greatest situation. They don't really have much going on for them. And what happens is they rebel, right? They know their rights, and as they're being disenfranchised and given this martial land, they rebel in Bacon's Rebellion. And this threatens the very lifeblood and prosperity of Virginia. And so very quickly then these farmers realize that the problem is freed indentured servants are simply the issue, right? They're the problem. They're the issue. They have to be dealt with or ignored. They can't be ignored, right? And so the group that's moving from being unfree to free then causes a problem. They want political, social, economic land rights that they're not getting, and they have to be somehow placated, or else there's rebellion. And initially, there's a lot of opportunity, right, to buy land, to have good tobacco plantations to make money. But over time, right, the land, the valuable land, is being bought up and monopolized by the first few families that are there. And so what we see are this decreasing economic opportunities for incoming groups. And there's a sense of that you always need workers, but how do you get the workers? Okay. What we see is Maryland being established as a safe haven for Catholics, right? Again, England's still kind of divided up between Protestants and Catholics, and so just like religious disenfranchised groups are moving to the New England, we have other religious groups moving to Maryland, where there's established no church and kind of a act concerning religion, which guarantees some degree of religious freedom very early on in the American experience. The family life of both is quite interesting because you have high death rates, right? The men keep dying off at very alarming rates. Certainly the work, the malaria, the life leads to very low life expectancy, leading to a lot of power for women and, kind of very chronically unstable families. And so what we see is power shifting toward women who generally survive and families kind of being up to debate. You can just see an actual indentured contract here. Here you can just see kind of a very optimistic view on land settlement in North America. Here you can see the settlement that's taking place in Maryland and Virginia. Again, the key point here is that you're moving in on indigenous land and you're moving kind of along the waterways, right? Why waterways? Because waterways are the lifeblood of trade. So very quickly, Jamestown goes from being on this marginal backwater that's on the verge of starvation or even incorporation into the Powhatan Confederacy to being a major thriving outpost of English settlement, largely due to the importance of tobacco. In contrast, what we have was a Puritan settlement of New England. First the Pilgrims and then larger numbers of Puritans come over because they simply view the Anglican Church out of the Reformation as being too Catholic, right? Henry VII says, I'm going to change the name of the church to Anglican from Catholic, but not really much else. And so what happens is that religion becomes an issue as Puritans want to literally purify the English church of its Catholic tendencies and relics. They're persecuted. The Pilgrims go to the Netherlands and then to the New World. The Puritans want to establish more of a pure religious society in North America. And so, again, they're trying to purify and get rid of Catholic practices, looking back to the early Christian church. In kind of this interesting manner, right? The church becomes the only religious institution, and so by and large, the church is going to dominate social, cultural, economic life in areas of the New World. And we have this idea of predestination, right? It's always predetermined. Already predetermined if you're going to heaven or hell, which causes a huge degree of religious anxiety. We have all these kind of religious focused ideas floating around throughout the settlement of New England, right? You can see that Massachusetts colony here, the Plymouth colony here, very quickly, Rhode Island is set up for those people that don't want to abide by the same rules as the Puritans to the north in Massachusetts. And again, very quickly, again, along the rivers, you have the settlement of Connecticut as well, again, mostly by Puritans as well. So we have kind of religious freedom over here, led by Roger Williams, but we have Puritan Society, and Puritan Society here. So very quickly, we see them move inland, and the reaction, of course, is war. We have major Pequot Wars in Connecticut, and you have a native conflict really throughout the region. Again, here you can see the Salem witch court trial is highlighting the overall importance and concern over religion, right? If you believe, if you're very religious and you believe in heaven, you certainly believe in the devil as well, and the devil can attempt to take control of people who are going to practice witchcraft, and we have the accusations of witchcraft kind of flying in Salem, of course. And we have a very small village-based community, so unlike kind of the almost a plantation economy. That's a tobacco plantation economy developing in Virginia, which is like a house on a large farm. Here we have a village based communities, right? They're largely closed. They don't need workers, and they're largely not want workers. This is why you have to keep moving, because there's limited economic opportunity for outsiders, and they're kind of given preference to the first settlers that are there, right? They're very patriarchal. In life and the economy, social life, you name it, revolves around the Puritan Church. And this kind of manifests itself, as I already said, in the Salem witch trials. And so we have these kind of very village-based communities. We have families being key. We have women and men surviving in much higher numbers than their counterparts in Virginia, and they're going to raise kind of these very self-sufficient, focused communities. So after all this, England rediscovers its empire. So the English colonies in the New World are largely given to themselves, right, for the first couple of generations of their existence. And then after England, we get it back together again. What we have is a new focus on using mercantilism that I talked about last time as a way of controlling, exploiting, and making money from their colonial endeavors, right? But in all this, the Glorious Revolution that ousts the Catholic monarchs and brings in Protestant monarchs in England is going to solidify, especially in the American popular thought, this idea of liberty and balanced government, right? And again, this is a major cornerstone of American belief. Liberty means you're free from the interference of the government. You're free from absolute rule. There's limited power of the government. There's checks and balances. The government can only do and say what it's been accustomed to doing, right? It can't just do as it pleases. It can't just arbitrarily arrest you, take your stuff, imprison you, or kill you. No, right? It can't arbitrarily tax you. No, right? You're free from the interference of the government in as many ways as possible, including religion, again, depending on where we're talking about. Also, you have notions of balanced government that become important in England during this time period that quickly get transformed and transferred to America. That England is going to have a divided government in which the king is being checked by the power of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? And so there's some degree of representation, especially in the House of Commons, where tax bills have to originate and the people have some degree of say in the government. And a lot of these beliefs are going to be enshrined in local constitutions, right? As these settlements are being set up, they're establishing kind of a governing compact. And a lot of these governing compacts revolve around notions of representative government and freedoms, right? And so the royalist government, the Royal English government reasserts direct control over all this settlement, but they kind of have to negotiate and allow for some of the continuation of North American practices that had been set up during this period of benign neglect, when people are pretty much doing what they want, doing as they want when they want it. And so what you see again are changes to North American life being fundamental process of this expansion, settlement, and interaction. And what you see is the quick settlement and expansion of English colonies, especially in places like Virginia, Maryland, and certainly in New England. Right, once one generation is there, almost within 2 or 3 generations, new colonies, new areas, new towns are set up, and kind of what you have is this quick expansion of English power to the degree that very soon there's going to be 13 separate, independently functioning colonies out of this kind of very minor settlements of Jamestown and Plymouth. All right, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this overview of the early American settlement and North American indigenous relations, and I hope it kind of gives you a better sense of early American history.